I was wounded and still holding the approach when the orders stopped reaching me. The doctrine said hold, but my ammunition said otherwise. They told me to surrender, certain the system had already finished its work. I counted what I had left and asked for 8 bullets. In the late summer of 1942, the Southwestern Pacific had become the central focus of Allied operations against Imperial Japan. Following the landings on Guadalcanal in August, United States forces found themselves committed to a prolonged contest over a narrow strip of land whose importance far exceeded its size. Henderson Field, a partially completed Japanese airstrip seized by U.S. Marines in the opening days of the campaign, became the operational center of gravity. Control of the airfield meant control of the surrounding sea lanes, and control of those lanes shaped the flow of men, aircraft, and supplies across the Solomon Islands. By September, the campaign had settled into a pattern of daily strain. Japanese naval and ground forces sought to retake the island through nighttime reinforcement runs and repeated infantry assaults. American units, short of supplies and often isolated, were tasked with holding defensive lines under constant pressure. Heat, disease, and exhaustion were as much a part of daily life as combat itself. There were no clear front lines in the European sense, only perimeters carved into jungle and coral, defined by foxholes, machine gun positions, and hastily marked trails. Within this environment, individual soldiers and Marines performed routine duties that were rarely routine in effect. Observation posts were established along ridgelines and jungle approaches. Rifle squads rotated between forward positions and reserve areas when possible, though rotation was irregular and often delayed. Wounded men were evacuated when circumstances allowed, but evacuation depended on terrain, enemy fire, and available manpower. Many injuries were treated near the line, with the expectation that the wounded would return to duty if they could still function. The American serviceman at the center of this account arrived on Guadalcanal as part of a ground combat unit tasked with perimeter defense. His role was neither unique nor elevated by rank. Like many others, he was responsible for maintaining a sector of the line, observing likely avenues of approach, and responding to enemy movement as ordered. His daily routine involved cleaning weapons, reinforcing cover, and watching the jungle for signs that were often indistinct: broken foliage, unusual sounds, or sudden silence. By mid-September, Japanese forces had begun probing attacks against American positions along the perimeter. These were not always full-scale assaults. More often, they were tests, small groups advancing under cover of darkness, attempting to locate weaknesses or draw fire. The objective was information as much as territory. For the defenders, this meant long hours of alertness with little sleep, punctuated by brief but intense exchanges of fire. During one such engagement, the American was wounded. The circumstances were not exceptional by the standards of the campaign. An exchange of fire occurred at close range, visibility limited by vegetation and low light. A projectile struck him, causing an injury that would normally have justified evacuation. However, evacuation was not immediately possible. The position he occupied was forward of easier routes back to aid stations, and movement under fire risked further casualties. Medical attention was minimal and improvised. A field dressing was applied. Pain was present but controlled. The wound limited his mobility but did not immediately prevent him from continuing to observe his sector. In the context of Guadalcanal, this placed him among a large number of men who remained at their posts despite injury, either because replacement was not available or because withdrawal would compromise the defense. As daylight came, the tactical situation remained uncertain. Japanese forces were known to be nearby, and intelligence suggested that further attempts to penetrate the perimeter were likely. The Americans' position overlooked a narrow approach through dense growth. From this vantage point, he could see only short distances, but the path itself represented one of the few routes through the terrain that could support movement by a small unit. Throughout the morning, activity was limited. The humidity was heavy, and the jungle remained largely still. Occasional sounds carried, distant artillery, aircraft overhead, but nothing immediate. This quiet did not indicate safety. On Guadalcanal, periods of stillness often preceded sudden contact. By early afternoon, the limitations of the American defensive posture became more apparent. Ammunition resupply was irregular, units had landed with limited stocks, and ongoing naval engagements restricted the delivery of additional supplies. Individual positions depended on what could be carried forward by hand. The wounded American assessed his remaining ammunition and adjusted his expectations accordingly. There was no guarantee that resupply would arrive before nightfall. Communication with adjacent positions existed but was constrained. Field telephones were unreliable and runners risked interception. Orders, when they arrived, were often delayed or incomplete. The operational doctrine emphasized holding ground, but it did not always account for the realities of isolation at the small unit level. Decisions frequently fell to individuals on the line, who acted based on observation rather than instruction. As the afternoon progressed, signs of enemy presence became more distinct. Movement was detected along the approach route. Whether this represented a reconnaissance element or the beginning of a larger effort was unclear. The American remained at his post, observing and waiting, aware that his injury limited his ability to relocate quickly if the situation deteriorated. This was not yet a moment of crisis, but it marked the transition from routine defense to heightened risk. The operational problem facing the American unit was becoming clearer: limited manpower, constrained supply, and an enemy willing to press forward despite losses. The wounded American's continued presence at his position reflected both necessity and the expectations placed on individuals in this campaign. As daylight began to fade, the balance between doctrine and circumstance grew more fragile. The perimeter held, but only through constant vigilance and the willingness of individuals to remain exposed under unfavorable conditions. The events that followed would emerge from this context, not from sudden revelation, but from the accumulated pressure of an environment that allowed little margin for error. As evening approached on Guadalcanal, the operational situation tightened rather than relaxed. Dusk did not bring relief, it brought uncertainty. Japanese doctrine emphasized movement and attack under cover of darkness, exploiting the limited visibility and the difficulties American units faced coordinating fire and communication at night. This pattern was well established by September 1942, and the defenders expected renewed pressure once daylight faded. The wounded American remained at his position as light diminished. His injury, while painful, had stabilized. He adjusted his posture to reduce strain and maintained his field of view along the narrow jungle approach. The surrounding terrain offered little flexibility. Dense vegetation restricted lateral movement, and the ground sloped unevenly, making withdrawal slow even for an uninjured man. In the absence of direct orders to fall back, he remained where he was. Nearby positions reported intermittent contact as night fell. Small arms fire flared briefly and then subsided. These exchanges were not coordinated assaults, but localized engagements, consistent with Japanese infiltration tactics. Rather than advancing in mass, enemy units often moved in dispersed groups, attempting to penetrate gaps or isolate individual positions. This approach increased the burden on defenders, who had to remain alert in all directions. The American's ammunition supply continued to weigh on his assessment of the situation. He counted magazines again, noting that each round now carried greater significance. Resupply had not arrived, and there was no indication that it would before morning. The broader logistical picture offered little reassurance. Japanese naval activity continued to threaten Allied shipping, and supply convoys were sporadic and contested. What reached the island was often prioritized for units deemed most critical, leaving forward positions dependent on existing stocks. Shortly after nightfall, movement along the approach route became more deliberate. Shapes appeared intermittently against the darker background of foliage. The American waited, adhering to the guidance given to perimeter defenders. Do not fire unless a clear target presents itself. Premature firing risked revealing positions and drawing concentrated return fire. This restraint, while doctrinally sound, placed additional psychological strain on individuals already fatigued and wounded. When contact occurred, it was brief but close. A small Japanese element moved forward, testing the position. The American fired selectively, aiming to deter rather than pursue. The exchange ended quickly, leaving uncertainty about the enemy's intentions. No follow-up attack came immediately, but the silence that followed was not reassuring. Elsewhere along the perimeter, similar encounters unfolded. Reports filtered through by runner and radio, each fragmentary and delayed. Units reported casualties, confusion, and difficulty determining the scale of enemy movement. Command elements struggled to assemble a coherent picture from incomplete information. The official doctrine emphasized holding the perimeter intact, but it did not fully address how isolated positions were to adapt when cut off or overwhelmed incrementally. As the night progressed, the American became increasingly aware of the limitations imposed by his condition. Movement caused sharp pain, and prolonged stillness led to stiffness and numbness. These physical constraints narrowed his options. If forced to reposition quickly, he would do so at significant risk. Nevertheless, abandoning the position without orders would have exposed the approach route and potentially compromised adjacent sectors. At some point after midnight, renewed movement was detected. This time, the approach was slower and more cautious. He could hear muffled sounds, branches displaced, equipment shifting, suggesting a larger presence than before. He waited, conserving ammunition and focusing on identifying clear targets. When he fired, it was with purpose, not volume. The response was immediate. Return fire struck nearby cover, splintering wood and earth. The exchange was more intense than earlier contact, though still limited in duration. When it ended, the American assessed his situation again. His ammunition was reduced further. His injury had reopened slightly, and blood loss, while not severe, added to fatigue. Attempts to communicate his status to rear positions were unsuccessful. The field telephone line was dead, and sending a runner was impractical under the circumstances. He was, for the moment, operationally isolated. This condition was not unique on Guadalcanal. It was common enough to be expected, though rarely acknowledged explicitly in planning documents. The gap between doctrine and reality became increasingly evident. Official guidance assumed a degree of coordination and support that the environment did not consistently provide. Individuals were expected to hold positions, yet the means to do so, resupply, reinforcement, medical evacuation, were uncertain. Decisions at the small unit level were shaped less by written orders than by immediate necessity. As hours passed, the Japanese pressure did not culminate in a full assault. Instead, it persisted in fragments. The American repelled additional probing movements, each time with diminishing resources. His calculations shifted subtly. What had begun as a defensive task within a broader perimeter now felt increasingly like a solitary effort to delay or deny access along a single route. By the early hours of the morning, the cumulative effect of fatigue, injury, and sustained contact altered his understanding of the situation. Holding indefinitely was no longer a realistic assumption. The question was no longer whether the position could be defended under ideal conditions, but how long it could be maintained under the actual conditions present. This recognition did not produce panic or dramatic action. It produced adjustment. The American conserved ammunition more strictly. He prepared mentally for closer contact and for the possibility that formal support might not arrive in time. These were not acts of defiance against orders, but adaptations within their limits. As the night edged towards dawn, the perimeter still held, but its integrity depended increasingly on individuals operating at the edge of endurance. The American's position remained occupied, but its continued defense rested on a narrowing margin. The operational problem had escalated, not through a single decisive moment, but through sustained pressure that eroded assumptions one exchange at a time.
Dawn on Guadalcanal did not bring clarity so much as exposure. As light filtered through the jungle canopy, positions that had been held through darkness became visible again, along with their limitations. Smoke hung low in some areas. The ground showed signs of the night's activity: disturbed earth, broken vegetation, spent cartridge cases. For those who had remained in place, the transition from night to day required immediate reassessment. The wounded American was still at his position. He had not slept. His injury had stiffened, and movement was slower than it had been the previous evening. The field dressing was soaked through, though bleeding had slowed. He took stock of his remaining ammunition with greater precision than before. The number was no longer abstract. It defined the outer boundary of his ability to influence what happened next. Japanese forces were known to exploit the early morning hours, using the confusion of changing light to reposition or withdraw. In some sectors, they disengaged before daylight to avoid air attack. In others, they remained close, concealed, waiting for opportunity. There was no uniform pattern, and the American had no reliable way to know which applied to his sector. Movement was detected again along the approach route. Unlike the previous night, the figures were easier to distinguish. They were not rushing forward. They advanced cautiously, stopping often, maintaining spacing. This behavior suggested discipline and awareness of the defender's presence. The American waited, holding fire. He understood that once he revealed his exact position again, the response would be immediate. At this stage of the campaign, both sides had learned from repeated contact. Japanese infantry units had adjusted to American defensive fire, while American defenders had learned that enemy withdrawal could be temporary. The absence of immediate assault did not indicate disengagement. As the figures drew closer, the American made a decision that marked a departure from routine procedure. He shifted his position slightly, despite the pain, to improve his angle of observation and fire. This adjustment reduced his own cover, but allowed him to better control the narrow approach. It was not ordered. It was a calculated risk based on the reality in front of him rather than the assumptions behind the original placement. When he fired, it was deliberate and limited. The objective was not to repel a massed attack, but to disrupt movement and impose caution. The effect was immediate. The Japanese element halted, returned fire briefly, and then withdrew out of sight. The exchange lasted only minutes, but it consumed more of the Americans' remaining ammunition. Afterward, the situation settled into a tense stillness. No further movement was visible, but the absence of contact did not resolve the underlying problem. The American was now operating with severely constrained resources. He could not expect relief in the immediate term. His injury reduced his capacity to relocate quickly, and his isolation limited coordination with adjacent positions. It was in this context that the turning point occurred. The American reassessed his role not as a fixed component of a continuous line, but as an individual delaying element. This was a subtle but significant shift. Doctrine emphasized holding ground, but it also recognized the value of delay when holding was no longer feasible. The difference lay in who made that determination. Without formal instruction, the American adjusted his expectations and tactics. He resolved to engage only at distances where his fire would have maximum effect. He would not attempt to maintain constant presence or repel every probe. Instead, he would impose uncertainty on enemy movement for as long as his resources allowed. This was not a dramatic declaration or act of defiance. It was a quiet adaptation shaped by necessity. Many individuals on Guadalcanal made similar adjustments, though few were recorded in after-action reports. The focus of official documentation remained on unit movements and outcomes, not on the incremental decisions that sustained them. As the morning progressed, Japanese activity increased again. This time, the movement suggested a coordinated effort. Multiple figures appeared along the approach, using cover effectively. The American waited until they reached a point where the terrain limited their options. He then fired selectively, forcing them to ground. The return fire was heavier than before. Rounds struck close enough to shower his position with debris. One impact aggravated his injury, reopening the wound and increasing pain. He remained in place, adjusting his posture to maintain control of his weapon. The exchange lasted longer than previous contacts, consuming additional ammunition and further narrowing his margin. Afterward, the situation settled into a tense stillness. No further movement was visible, but the absence of contact did not resolve the underlying problem. The American was now operating with severely constrained resources. He could not expect relief in the immediate term. His injury reduced his capacity to relocate quickly, and his isolation limited coordination with adjacent positions. It was in this context that the turning point occurred. The American reassessed his role not as a fixed component of a continuous line, but as an individual delaying element. This was a subtle but significant shift. Doctrine emphasized holding ground, but it also recognized the value of delay when holding was no longer feasible. The difference lay in who made that determination. Without formal instruction, the American adjusted his expectations and tactics. He resolved to engage only at distances where his fire would have maximum effect. He would not attempt to maintain constant presence or repel every probe. Instead, he would impose uncertainty on enemy movement for as long as his resources allowed. This was not a dramatic declaration or act of defiance. It was a quiet adaptation shaped by necessity. Many individuals on Guadalcanal made similar adjustments, though few were recorded in after-action reports. The focus of official documentation remained on unit movements and outcomes, not on the incremental decisions that sustained them. As the morning progressed, Japanese activity increased again. This time, the movement suggested a coordinated effort. Multiple figures appeared along the approach, using cover effectively. The American waited until they reached a point where the terrain limited their options. He then fired selectively, forcing them to ground. The return fire was heavier than before. Rounds struck close enough to shower his position with debris. One impact aggravated his injury, reopening the wound and increasing pain. He remained in place, adjusting his posture to maintain control of his weapon. The exchange lasted longer than previous contacts, consuming additional ammunition and further narrowing his margin. Afterward, the situation settled into a tense stillness. No further movement was visible, but the absence of contact did not resolve the underlying problem. The American was now operating with severely constrained resources. He could not expect relief in the immediate term. His injury reduced his capacity to relocate quickly, and his isolation limited coordination with adjacent positions. It was in this context that the turning point occurred. The American reassessed his role not as a fixed component of a continuous line, but as an individual delaying element. This was a subtle but significant shift. Doctrine emphasized holding ground, but it also recognized the value of delay when holding was no longer feasible. The difference lay in who made that determination. Without formal instruction, the American adjusted his expectations and tactics. He resolved to engage only at distances where his fire would have maximum effect. He would not attempt to maintain constant presence or repel every probe. Instead, he would impose uncertainty on enemy movement for as long as his resources allowed. This was not a dramatic declaration or act of defiance. It was a quiet adaptation shaped by necessity. Many individuals on Guadalcanal made similar adjustments, though few were recorded in after-action reports. The focus of official documentation remained on unit movements and outcomes, not on the incremental decisions that sustained them. As the morning progressed, Japanese activity increased again. This time, the movement suggested a coordinated effort. Multiple figures appeared along the approach, using cover effectively. The American waited until they reached a point where the terrain limited their options. He then fired selectively, forcing them to ground. The return fire was heavier than before. Rounds struck close enough to shower his position with debris. One impact aggravated his injury, reopening the wound and increasing pain. He remained in place, adjusting his posture to maintain control of his weapon. The exchange lasted longer than previous contacts, consuming additional ammunition and further narrowing his margin. Afterward, the situation settled into a tense stillness. No further movement was visible, but the absence of contact did not resolve the underlying problem. The American was now operating with severely constrained resources. He could not expect relief in the immediate term. His injury reduced his capacity to relocate quickly, and his isolation limited coordination with adjacent positions. It was in this context that the turning point occurred. The American reassessed his role not as a fixed component of a continuous line, but as an individual delaying element. This was a subtle but significant shift. Doctrine emphasized holding ground, but it also recognized the value of delay when holding was no longer feasible. The difference lay in who made that determination. Without formal instruction, the American adjusted his expectations and tactics. He resolved to engage only at distances where his fire would have maximum effect. He would not attempt to maintain constant presence or repel every probe. Instead, he would impose uncertainty on enemy movement for as long as his resources allowed.
This was not a dramatic declaration or act of defiance. It was a quiet adaptation shaped by necessity. Many individuals on Guadalcanal made similar adjustments, though few were recorded in after-action reports. The focus of official documentation remained on unit movements and outcomes, not on the incremental decisions that sustained them. As the morning progressed, Japanese activity increased again. This time, the movement suggested a coordinated effort. Multiple figures appeared along the approach, using cover effectively. The American waited until they reached a point where the terrain limited their options. He then fired selectively, forcing them to ground. The return fire was heavier than before. Rounds struck close enough to shower his position with debris. One impact aggravated his injury, reopening the wound and increasing pain. He remained in place, adjusting his posture to maintain control of his weapon. The exchange lasted longer than previous contacts, consuming additional ammunition and further narrowing his margin. When the firing subsided, the American found himself in a precarious state. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his injury was worsening, and he had no clear avenue for withdrawal that would not expose him to immediate fire. Communication with rear positions remained non-existent. The assumption that support would arrive eventually was no longer sufficient. In the hours that followed, the Japanese approach changed. Instead of repeated probes, there was a pause, followed by movement that suggested encirclement rather than frontal testing. The American could not see all of this directly, but the sounds and patterns indicated a shift. He understood that remaining in his current position indefinitely was no longer viable. This realization forced another unofficial decision. Rather than attempting to disengage immediately, which would likely result in exposure and loss, he prepared to hold his position until contact became unavoidable. His objective was no longer to deny the route entirely, but to delay movement and draw attention, buying time for the broader perimeter. This choice carried personal risk. With limited ammunition and restricted mobility, the margin for error was minimal. Yet within the context of Guadalcanal, such risks were often accepted implicitly. The distinction between personal survival and mission requirement was not always clearly defined at the small unit level. As midday approached, Japanese forces closed in further. Voices could be heard intermittently, not shouted commands, but low, controlled communication. The American remained silent, conserving his final rounds. He waited for a moment when his actions would matter most. The situation had reached a point where the next engagement would be decisive for his position. He was no longer operating within the routine expectations of perimeter defense. He was operating at the boundary where individual judgment replaced formal instruction. This moment did not announce itself with sudden intensity. It emerged gradually, shaped by exhaustion, injury, and the cumulative effect of sustained contact. The Americans' earlier adjustments had delayed this point, but they could not prevent it indefinitely. By the time Japanese soldiers appeared clearly within his immediate field of view, the context was fully established. He was wounded, nearly out of ammunition, isolated, and facing an enemy that had adapted to his presence. The choices available to him now were sharply limited, defined not by doctrine, but by circumstance. The next phase would test not only his resolve, but the assumptions under which he had been operating since arriving on the island. The risk was no longer abstract, it had become immediate and personal. By early afternoon, The tactical isolation of the Americans' position was no longer theoretical. Japanese soldiers had maneuvered close enough that individual movements could be distinguished without difficulty. The approach route he had been denying was now occupied at multiple points, not by a single probing element, but by a coordinated group advancing with caution and intent. The American remained in place. His ammunition was reduced to a final count that could no longer support sustained fire. Each remaining round had a specific purpose, and none could be wasted on suppression or warning. His injury had worsened, limiting his ability to change position without assistance. Blood loss and dehydration compounded fatigue, dulling sensation in his hands and making precise movement more difficult. The Japanese advance halted just beyond immediate contact range. This pause was deliberate. Instead of continuing forward under fire, the enemy element repositioned, spreading slightly while maintaining line of sight on the Americans' cover. The absence of immediate firing suggested that they had assessed his position and recognized its constraints. A voice called out from the jungle. It was controlled and clear, delivered in accented but understandable English. The words were not shouted. They carried the tone of instruction rather than threat. The American was told that his position was surrounded. He was informed that resistance was no longer effective. He was offered the opportunity to surrender. Such exchanges were not unheard of in the Pacific, though they were uncommon. Japanese forces sometimes called for surrender when they believed the tactical advantage was complete, particularly when an enemy position could be taken with additional casualties that commanders preferred to avoid. The effectiveness of such calls varied. Cultural assumptions, language barriers, and mutual distrust often rendered them ineffective. The American did not respond immediately. He remained silent, listening. The voice continued, repeating the offer. The implication was clear. If he did not surrender, the position would be taken by force. From the Americans' perspective, the situation had reached its narrowest point. Withdrawal was no longer feasible. Reinforcement had not arrived and could not be assumed. His ability to delay further was limited by ammunition rather than will. The operational value of his continued resistance lay primarily in the time already gained. The Japanese voice added a final statement. If he did not surrender, he would be killed. The American considered this assessment. It aligned with his own. The threat was not exaggerated. He was wounded, isolated, and outnumbered. His position could be overrun once the Japanese chose to advance in force. He replied. His response was brief and measured. He stated that he would continue to fight, but that he required additional ammunition to do so. Specifically, he asked for 8 bullets. The request was not rhetorical. It reflected the approximate number of rounds he believed would allow him to continue meaningful resistance for a short time longer. It was not a declaration of intent to hold indefinitely, nor was it an attempt to provoke. It was an acknowledgment of his situation, expressed without embellishment. The Japanese response was immediate but restrained. There was a pause, followed by a short exchange among the soldiers out of sight. No ammunition was provided. The voice returned, repeating the offer to surrender. The American did not reply again. What followed was a brief but intense engagement. Japanese soldiers advanced, using available cover, firing as they moved. The American returned fire with his remaining ammunition, selecting targets carefully and conserving rounds. Each shot was deliberate. He did not fire continuously. He fired when movement presented a clear opportunity. The exchange lasted only minutes. When his ammunition was exhausted, the American remained in position. He did not attempt to flee or reposition. His weapon was empty, and his injury prevented effective movement. The Japanese advance slowed, then stopped again, as soldiers reassessed the situation at close range.
At this distance, the American's condition was evident. He was wounded and weakened, but conscious and alert. His posture suggested that he was no longer capable of resistance, but his presence still imposed caution. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized minimizing unnecessary exposure, even when numerical advantage was clear. Another call was made. The American was instructed to surrender. This time, the instruction was accompanied by gestures indicating that he should emerge slowly and unarmed. The threat of immediate fire was implicit rather than stated. The American complied. He moved carefully, raising his hands to show that he no longer held a weapon. The movement was slow, controlled by pain and exhaustion rather than fear. He was taken into custody without further resistance. The immediate tactical outcome was unremarkable. The position was neutralized. The approach route was no longer denied. From an operational perspective, this was a localized success for the Japanese unit. From the American side, the loss of the position was offset by the delay imposed and the information gathered through sustained contact. The American was searched and relieved of personal items. His wound was inspected briefly. There was no immediate medical treatment beyond ensuring that bleeding was controlled. He was moved away from the position under guard, his movements supported when necessary to prevent collapse. There was no further exchange of words regarding the earlier request. The Japanese soldiers did not comment on it, and the American did not repeat it. The moment passed without ceremony. In the broader context of the Guadalcanal campaign, this incident did not alter the overall trajectory of operations. The perimeter held elsewhere. Reinforcements and supplies would arrive in time to stabilize the situation. The island would remain contested for months, with outcomes determined by cumulative effort rather than individual actions. However, the incident illustrated a recurring tension between doctrine and reality. Official guidance assumed that positions could be held or withdrawn according to plan. The actual conditions faced by individuals on the line often required decisions that fell outside formal instruction. The American's request for ammunition was not an act of defiance or bravado. It was an expression of the precise limits within which he was operating. Following his capture, the American entered a different phase of the war, governed by circumstances beyond his control. His actions prior to that moment would not be recorded in official reports in detail. There would be no immediate recognition or documentation of the decisions he made under pressure. The stakes had peaked not in a single dramatic exchange, but in the convergence of injury, isolation, and finite resources. Authority, in the form of doctrine and command structure, had little influence at that point. The outcome was shaped by individual judgment exercised within a narrowing range of options. The consequences of those decisions would unfold over time, influencing how the incident was remembered, if it was remembered at all. The institutional response would be limited. The personal cost, however, would remain.
The American was moved rearward under guard, away from the immediate combat zone and toward a temporary holding area established by Japanese forces operating near the perimeter. His treatment during this movement reflected standard practice rather than personal attention. He was no longer an active threat, and his value was now informational rather than tactical. Guards were alert but not overtly aggressive. The urgency of combat had passed. Basic first aid was eventually applied to his wound. It was sufficient to prevent immediate deterioration, but not intended for recovery. In the weeks that followed, he was transferred through a series of improvised detention points before being moved off Guadalcanal entirely. This process mirrored the broader Japanese prisoner handling system in the early stages of the Pacific War. Decentralized, unevenly resourced, and heavily influenced by operational priorities rather than long-term planning. From an institutional perspective, the Americans' earlier actions on the perimeter were largely invisible. Small unit engagements of this type rarely generated detailed records unless they resulted in unusually large casualties or clear tactical shifts. His unit would later report him missing in action, then presumed captured. The circumstances of his wound, his isolation, and the exchange that preceded his surrender were not fully known at the time. Within Japanese reporting, the engagement was equally unremarkable. A forward position had been neutralized after resistance. No special notation was required. The request for ammunition, delivered calmly and without exaggeration, did not alter the official assessment of the encounter. It was neither mocked nor highlighted. It was simply absorbed into the larger flow of events. As the Guadalcanal campaign continued, the broader operational picture evolved. Japanese forces failed to dislodge the Americans from Henderson Field. Attrition, supply shortages, and sustained Allied reinforcement gradually shifted the balance. By early 1943, Japanese command authorized withdrawal from the island. The perimeter the American had helped defend, briefly and at high personal cost, remained in Allied hands. The American did not return with his unit. His war followed a different trajectory, defined by captivity, transport, and survival under conditions that varied by location and period. Like many prisoners taken in 1942, he endured uncertainty, limited communication, and long stretches without news of the war's progress. His wound healed imperfectly, leaving lasting effects. After the war, records were reconciled, status reports were updated, families received confirmation. In official histories, his name appeared, if at all, only in rosters and casualty lists. There was no formal citation connected to the stand he had made or the calculation he had voiced in that moment on the perimeter. Yet within the quiet accounting of the war, his actions fit a broader pattern. The Guadalcanal campaign was sustained not only by strategic decisions and large formations, but by individuals who operated at the margins of doctrine, making measured choices under constraint. The request for 8 bullets was not symbolic, it was precise. It reflected an understanding of limits, of ammunition, of physical endurance, and of what could reasonably be expected from one person in isolation. Such moments rarely entered official narratives because they did not lend themselves to simplification. They lacked spectacle. They did not resolve cleanly into victory or defeat. Instead, they illustrated how wars were actually fought at ground level, through incremental decisions made without certainty of recognition or outcome. In later years, historians examining the Guadalcanal campaign would note the strain placed on individual defenders and the frequency with which doctrine failed to account for environmental and logistical realities. Accounts from both sides acknowledged that control of the island hinged as much as endurance as maneuver. Within that context, the Americans' actions were neither exceptional nor trivial. They were representative. His legacy, like that of many others, was quiet. It existed in the space between official doctrine and lived experience. It remained largely unrecorded, preserved only through fragmentary testimony and retrospective reconstruction. The war moved on, institutions adjusted, and attention shifted to larger battles. What remained was the fact that at a specific time and place, a wounded individual assessed his situation clearly, communicated his limits without distortion, and acted accordingly. That moment did not change the course of the war. It did not need to. It was sufficient that it reflected the realities faced by those who bore its weight.